is Roger Green, host of the Surfing the NASH Tsunami podcast. Today we are offering 5 conversations from episode 36, in which first-time guest and Anglo-Australian hepatologist James O'Byrne joins Louise Campbell, old friend Naim Alkhouri, and me to discuss James's recent LOCATE-NAFLD study to evaluate strategies for and the value of recruiting high-risk referrals through primary care practices, plus a vault episode from last November addressing the psychology of diet decision-making. This conversation starts with Naim Alkhouri commending the basic idea of a randomized study on this topic and the sample size here, while ruminating on how effective the design will be in correctly assessing positive and negative predictive values. James O'Byrne describes some of the funding and regulatory issues that shape the design. As the conversation continues, it becomes clear that the median times to referral in the intervention and control groups were dramatically different, and that these differences will have real clinical impact in a world with approved NASH agents, possibly even before that. Louise Campbell raises the point that this kind of model can speed access to trials tremendously in terms of recruiting patients faster. James describes why patients were motivated to enroll in the study and the significant numbers of patients screened out, most often due to high levels of alcohol consumption. As the conversation winds down, James mentions 2 interesting pieces of data from early analysis: the finding of significant and clinically meaningful differences between successful FibroScan reads in the 2 groups, and separately, the lack of separation between the groups in patient quality of life scores. This podcast does not report much on studies from Australia, which is an environment with some unique challenges that other developed markets would do well to study more and understand better. This episode and its conversation covered parallels between Oz and the Western countries, and as a result, items the Western markets can take away when reviewing these results. It's quite a lot to digest and very exciting to consider. So sit back, listen, learn, enjoy, and when you're done, join the dialogue in our LinkedIn discussion group. So James, yes, just before we go on, Louise, Naim, questions you might have about the design or the background thinking on the study?
Naim Alkhouri.
For me, I think the fact that it's a randomized trial, kudos to you guys. I think that's the right way to do it. And I think, you will answer the questions in a more scientific way. As you said, I have no doubt that it will lead to a rapid FibroScan and decreasing the wait time. The question is, this identification is going to lead to better outcomes, and that's a very difficult one to answer. I looked at the protocol. I know that you are looking also at liver-related outcomes, including variceal bleeding and ascites and things like that. And this is where it gets tricky because we're starting in the kind of PCP population. This is not an enriched population, lower prevalence of advanced fibrosis and cirrhosis. And then we know that the rate of outcomes developing is relatively lower in such a population. So these are, some of the thoughts I had. Obviously, the 8 cut point, it does have a decent negative predictive value. I don't know what assumption you guys used, but we're not talking about like 95% negative predictive value. So you will still probably miss some patients. And then the positive predictive value is also relatively lower. Many people that will be included in the what we call the high risk group will actually not have significant fibrosis. They may have F0. We know the BMI affects the accuracy of FibroScan. So several thoughts, but I like the randomization. I like the sample size. Of course, larger sample size, the better, but also you have probably budget and some restrictions on how many patients you can include. I think if I remember correctly, you guys planned on enrolling 238, which my mind was on the smaller end of things. But again, I understand where you're coming from. So these are some of my initial thoughts. But I think, again, this is very important because for a disease this common, we need to find ways to expedite referring patients at risk of having more aggressive disease.
James O'Byrne.
I absolutely agree with all of those points, and we were hampered really in terms of the follow-up because we got an NHMRC grant to do this trial, and there's an endpoint to the study, which is sort of 3 years really after you get that grant money. So we had to be able to report. We do intend to follow up those longer-term outcomes from with this cohort, assuming we get some further funding. As you know, these things you need some results to be able to then build on and extend the analysis. We had to choose a cut point, and at the time, 8.2, 8.5, we thought we'd keep it quite simple. As it was, the 2 groups were quite matched, and about 27% of them fulfilled our definition of high risk. And you're right in that, the primary endpoint of the time to the diagnosis of high risk was dramatically shorter. So the median time from randomization to receiving a FibroScan and a diagnosis of advanced fibrosis or high risk, we can't really say advanced fibrosis, as you say, because of the positive predictive value, was 10 days. And at our 12-month follow-up mark, which was our planned sort of first analysis of longitudinal outcomes, 27% of the standard of care group had still not been seen in a secondary care clinic. So the headline is that this model affords you probably a year's advantage in terms of diagnosis of your stage of liver disease in suspected NASH-NAFLD. And in that time, you could argue, well, if you've just got lifestyle measures, a year is not really a big deal. But I think as we move into the era of, effective pharmacotherapy for NASH-NAFLD, a year could make a big difference in terms of stage of disease and fibrosis stage.
You said 10 days for the intervention group. What was the median time for FibroScan in the other group?
So the median time for FibroScan in the other group, 266 days.
Oh my God. Okay. Wow. So I'm sure this was statistically significant with the p-value less than 0.
Naim, about the time James got to 200, and I figured we could have stopped and we knew the answer right there, regardless of what the last two digits were. Yeah, I'm sure that's right.
And just another follow-up question. Did you guys collect labs like AST, ALT, platelets? Are you able to calculate a FIB-4 index, any other way to kind of increase the positive predictive value? And did you have any patients with cirrhosis that you identified?
So we do have all of that data. And again, that's going to be part of the primary analysis. So all of that data was collected at baseline and again at 12 months or when the patients were seen in secondary care. I would say that even though the low-risk patients we identified through the intervention, although we say we discharged them back to a general practitioner, we did, but we still had follow-up on those guys at 12 months for quality of life and things like that. So we do have longitudinal data in the entire group. Regarding the presence of cirrhosis, that was really defined as a sort of FibroScan reading of greater than 13.5. That was relatively small numbers, about 5% in each group. In terms of clinical outcomes, you're right, it's a very short time period for follow-up, although it's interesting that there were 2 variceal bleeds that occurred in the standard of care group within that follow-up period versus 0 in the intervention group. Now, that's really very small numbers, but it does tell you that within these groups, there are some people with pretty high-risk liver disease lurking there.
Louise Campbell.
I think the interesting thing is, yes, it speeds up access to FibroScan, but if we were looking at this as a trial population, potentially, it speeds up the access to people to be able to be recruited to trials and some of the bigger trials. So I think this is the benefit of utilising this type of model. You use nurse specialists who were highly skilled in FibroScan.
Absolutely.
So I presume that they were giving information and reporting back to the patient at the time, so they were able to allay the fears. Now, just going back to that 10 days, it's practically impossible to organise a clinic anywhere in 10 days. So was that because the patients themselves got the information, or you might not know this data yet, but was it because they were empowered because they managed to get the data, they managed to get the referral, and they were seen? Did that engage them? Because some people go, oh, that's too quick, I must have cancer, and do the opposite.
So the randomization process involved a screening period. So when we received the referral, all referrals with suspected NAFLD were screened for inclusion in the trial. And then the trial nurses would ring suitable patients and say, look, we're doing this study and this is what we're trying to achieve. If you want to take part, there's the randomization means that you might actually get a scan to answer the question about how bad your liver disease is within a couple of weeks, or you can wait in the standard of care and the things. So I think patients, by and large, were quite keen and motivated to take part in the study. We had to get rid of a lot of patients who we screened because of high-risk alcohol use. So more than half people were screen failures. I guess, you could say our entry criteria were quite strict, but having proven that the intervention works in terms of identification of higher risk disease, you can safely expand that in further studies to come. So interestingly, in terms of the successful FibroScanning, and you say they were highly specialist nurses, well-trained in FibroScan, they were also hepatology nurses, so they spent some time with the patients, talking to them about their diagnosis, provided them with a copy of their FibroScan results and written information about lifestyle changes in non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and that also was copied to their GP with some recommendations that for referral to dietetics, exercise physiology, pharmaceuticals, etc. So 98% of the FibroScans in the intervention arm were successful, and whilst it's open to interpretation, in the usual care arm, the standard of care arm, the successful initial FibroScan rate was only 77%. So there was a little bit of a drop off, and I suspect that was because maybe in the clinics people are coming and seeing maybe registrars who aren't perhaps as skilled as a dedicated nurse. As you know, Louise, if you're invested in the result and you know what you're doing, you can pretty much persist and get a decent FibroScan reading in most people. So we need to explore why there was a drop off in successful FibroScans in the usual care group. What I was interested to see though is certainly at 12 months, there was no difference in the quality of life outcomes in the usual care versus the intervention arm. And I would have expected that people who had had an earlier diagnosis of either severe or high risk liver disease, or indeed low risk, which is the majority, would have had an improved quality of life with one less thing to worry about. So we need to delve into that a bit more in our qualitative analysis with our patient focus groups and try and work out what the patient's attitudes are to a diagnosis of low risk versus high risk NAFLD.
And now, back to Roger.
We hope you've enjoyed this recording. If you have any questions or comments about the content of this conversation or the entire episode, please put them in the review section of the page from which you downloaded this conversation, or send an email to questions@surfingnash.com. We'll be back next week with another challenging topic. Till then, stay safe, surf on. We'll see you on the podcast. Bye-bye now.